difficult interview to perform. A lot of people think about investigative journalism and you're digging deep, but actually when you have to go and do those interviews and sit down with people and ask those tough questions, it can be tough. And I think it's a skill that journalists often struggle with. Not everybody can do it. From my experience, not everybody can do it. So it's my pleasure to introduce Litsa Sortis, executive producer of Marketplace, and she will take it from there. Thank you, Litsa.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So first I want to introduce two award-winning journalists who've done their fair share of investigating and accountability. First of all, you probably recognize Avery Haynes. She just recently joined CTV's W5, and she's brought some examples for us to look at of some different kinds of accountability interviews in the TV or video format. One of the docs that she wanted to highlight was something she did about abuse allegations in the Jehovah's Witnesses. So that was something that just aired this year on W5, a pedophile cover-up. In 2017, Avery spent 2 weeks living in an abandoned mosque in the final days of the offensive against ISIS in Mosul, Iraq. She shot and produced a 1-hour doc called 2 Kilometers to Terror, Life and Death under Mosul, Iraq. She's gone to Liberia and West Africa to meet a woman she's become pen pals with, the wife of convicted warlord Charles Taylor. She shot and produced that herself, so she's, unlike many of the hosts that I've actually worked with in my time, she seems to be a one-woman show. Before joining W5, she spent 7 years at City News Toronto as a daily reporter with a focus on long-format investigative. And then on the other side, we've got Stuart. Stuart Bell is a national online investigative journalist at Global News. He's the author of 3 nonfiction books, most recently Bayou of Pigs. Did I pronounce that properly? I've struggled. I thought about this word a lot. He's reported from dozens of countries. His magazine article about child soldiers in West Africa, Guerrilla Girls, was awarded the Amnesty International Prize. He won the South Haven Journalists Award. I can go on and on. He's a well-decorated investigative journalist. So I'm just going to start this off. First of all, I want to know how many of you here are exclusively print journalists. You work print digital only. One of you, okay. 2 of you. And the rest of you, a mix. How many of you are long format investigative? Have worked in that field? Okay. Okay, that's great. So the first question I'm going to ask, because it kind of threw us when we, in our background discussion, was what the heck's an accountability interview? And I'm going to start with Stuart. What was your understanding of that when you were asked to join the panel?
Yeah, well, so when I was told that this topic of this was accountability interviews, I really didn't know what it meant, to be honest with you. It's not a term that I've ever used. I've heard it once in a while sort of around TV circles, but not something that that I sort of was conscious of. And I'm guessing that's probably because it's more of a TV term and I've spent my career in print. Right. As far as I can tell, though, I think it's that phase in your reporting where you take the allegations or whatever that you've are the base of your story, and you approach the people and you ask them what they have to say. You hold them to account, I guess. I think maybe too often, it's that scene in a news story on TV where the reporter is chasing after the villain of the story, sort of shouting questions and getting the door slammed, or getting the camera knocked away, or the car pulling away.
Sound familiar?
I've certainly done some of that a little bit, but not that much. I don't really do that style of reporting. And I'm not really sure how valuable it is, if it's anything more than sort of theatrics, or even how much of an appetite there is for it, how much readers or viewers really appreciate that kind of scene. Now, really, I think our job as reporters it's not necessarily to hold people to account. It's to tell stories. And I know there's that school of thought about where our job as journalists is to hold the powerful to account and afflict the comfortable or whatever. That's really only part of what we do. I think really overall what we do is tell stories and try to tell them fairly and accurately. And of course, part of that is seeking the opinions of people, everybody around. And to that extent, I'm not sure there's a special interview that's the accountability interview.
It's interesting.
Sorry, I'm going to be a total contrarian here.
Yeah, no, that's good.
I don't even think it is a contrarian. I think that that's generally the new school of thought when it comes to television journalism as well. And I think that there was a day where 60 Minutes and W5 and other television programs really made that be their mark, where they were going to run after the guy that you had invested, your viewers had invested in hating, and you knew you weren't going to get anything out of it, but you were going to still shout the questions at that person and record that, and it was going to be like an event part of your story. Mm-hmm. I think there's a move away from that, and I think that when we were talking about this beforehand, from print to television, accountability interview, in my mind, is totally a television catchphrase, but it has become a part of long form, especially storytelling and any other kind of storytelling. But I kind of break it down into a number of different kinds of accountability interviews. So there's the one where it's usually like a person in power, and they know that you're going to try to get them, and you know that they're going to try to evade that getting, and it's kind of like a dance that you play. And the most that you're going to hope for is that their lack of answering is going to expose what you believe should be exposed. And it rarely ever happens, they're going to say, "Oh my God, you were right. I did lie." That's right. That doesn't ever happen. You go in hoping that it will. So there's that. And then there's the interview. Like, I think there's an accountability interview with the bad guy who thinks that he's going to be able to get out of being a bad guy by agreeing to do an interview. And he ends up showing, or she ends up showing herself to actually be the bad guy in the end by just agreeing to talk. And then there is what your perception of an accountability interview is, which is it's called an ambush interview, it's called a jump, or W5 calls it an unscheduled interview. And that can either be with the bad guy, that can be with a politician. I don't find those are often very productive. When I'm watching as a viewer, I often look at the person who's the bad guy, and I feel bad for them because the reporter looks like such a jerk that I think, oh, that doesn't really work, and you're not really getting much out of it. But I think that, and I also think that more and more journalism now doesn't rely on one interview for accountability. The entire story is about making somebody accountable.
And we're going to look at some different kinds of examples, but I just wanted to ask Stuart first, what makes you think the audience doesn't like those interviews anymore?
Well, I don't have any sort of scientific proof that there's been a decline in desire for that. I'm just not sure that it really adds anything. I don't, as a viewer, I don't find it valuable. But I mean, the other issue, I guess, is if you're having an accountability interview, deciding who is accountable is in itself a judgment call. It's almost an editorial decision, and who you decide is accountable could depend on your perception or biases. I mean, is the bad guy accountable for what the bad things he's done, or is his parents, or is it society for whatever led him to becoming a bad guy? Is it the state or the government for not sufficiently protecting people? I mean, there's just so many. Right. I mean, everybody is accountable in some way, and sort of singling out one accountability, one person, one character to be accountable, I think is a bit false, and it's also, like I say, it's an editorial decision.
And it's so dependent on the story that you're doing. I mean, I think in politics, it's relatively clear who you need to go after. Sure. Mm-hmm. I think when you're doing investigations into terror organizations or Canadians, that's far more complex. And the beauty of long-form investigative stuff is that you're able to explore the nuance in that, and you realize that the bad guy generally isn't always just like the archetypal bad guy with the cloak on being bad, but. I also think that the time that this time in our careers in journalism is tricky for holding anyone to account, whether it's in the form of an interview that's sort of theatrical or not, because with so much consumption of daily news, where you just have to get somebody to say something, politicians in particular are now okay
Right.
with refusing interviews and delivering a nonsense statement.
Mm-hmm.
And that is all, like, it's okay, at least we got something because we did due diligence in getting their perspective on something, getting their chance to respond. But really, it's kind of a free pass because you can't ask the follow-up question, which is always the most important question in an accountability interview. And, you know, the number of times that I know that I've had to rely on statements that are because of somebody is just saying they're going to skip having to be put forward in front of someone who's going to really quiz them about something.
Yeah, no, I find that as well. We're getting statements, and it's almost like some PR person somewhere has said, you know what, don't do this interview. It's better to just give a statement. And it's almost like how far should we go, and what does that do to the public when they just keep saying statement after statement after statement?
Yeah. Well,
So
we're
how
really
far
in a
do we
different.
go,
I mean,
right?
things have changed. Through the sort of media revolution, things have changed in the sense that people don't need to talk to us anymore. You know,
Yeah.
there was a time, it wasn't that long ago, when, you know, if somebody knew you were doing a story that would cast them in a bad light or whatever, they knew they had to talk to you to deliver their side of the story.
Right.
But increasingly, they don't have to. I mean, they can get their side of the story out on their own platforms. And so, you know, we see people that are in these situations putting their story on Facebook, putting it, you know, on Instagram or whatever, as opposed to having to talk to us. So that, I think there's been some shift in the way that we have to deal with those people that we're sort of investigating and looking at, and
Right.
holding, you know, that sort of interview.
And so you both have a nuanced sense of accountability, but for me, it's sort of about you spend months or weeks investigating. All these concerns have been brought to your attention, and then it's almost like you are going to a place that the general public can't access. It's not their Twitter feed, it's not their Facebook page, it's not their PR spin. You can find people in a way, and you have to go with the public's questions. And I think you talked about how highfalutin that sounded, but I think that's still sort of the role. And I think you brought some examples where even though you do have a nuanced sense, you did have to go and do some in-your-face doorstep.
There are times, and anybody who, and this is more of a television component to it, but when you're working, when you've got a team of people and you have been working for months on an investigation, so the accountability interview always comes at the end of your investigation, or at the end of when you have as many facts as possible. I think that's probably the same for you, right? Maybe you go back afterwards, but generally the way that it would work for us is that we get as much information as we can about our story. We get everything laid out, so we know when we're going to have that accountability interview, we sort of have all the facts. But that's sort of a daunting task because you know that everyone is sort of relying on you getting them to say or not say something. So I think I did bring some clips, and it's not as though these are like pillar examples of excellent journalism at all, but I brought them just because we have an hour and it added an element as well. So W5 did an investigation. We worked with the lawyers who were working on a class action lawsuit against Norm Barwin, who is a doctor in Ottawa. Dr. Baby God is what he was known for decades, in that he was the guy that could get anybody pregnant in the fertility world. So if you could not have a baby, you prayed that you could get Dr. Baby God, Norm Barwin, to be your fertility doctor. And he had just the most incredible success. He also, according to 50 people who've now come forward in the class action lawsuit, used his own sperm, used other people's sperm, instead of the people that they thought. So all of these children are finding out that their dads are not their biological dads, or that Norm Barwin is their father. Like so in the investigation that we did, we sort of really laid out how emotional and dramatic and challenging this was for these people. And we knew going into that Norm Barwin isn't going to say, let me sit down and tell you my side of the story, because he's in the midst of a class action lawsuit. So we do due diligence and send letters requesting a sit down, and he said no. So it came to be that the decision was made that we'd have to do an unscheduled interview at his home in Ottawa. And Norm Barwin is old. He's almost 80. He's little and a very sympathetic sort of beside the facts person. And I just had this like pit in my stomach about like being this, sort of heavy-handed person, sort of accosting him and asking him questions, and yet also did feel, as highfalutin as it may sound, that the people that I spoke to who had been so damaged by him never had the opportunity to ask the questions that I was going to be able to ask him. So I was really glad that I had lost my voice because I sounded much weaker than I normally do when I went up on the street. So in the clip, we also managed to find a journalism student did an interview with Norm Barwin back when the first lawsuits first started in mid-2000s, 2009. So we unearthed this never-before-seen documentary where she sort of, footage that she asked him, and then I went to his house. So I've just isolated sort of a, I think, 2-minute piece, and I hope it works, because...
Before his stunning fall from grace, Dr. Norman Barwin was an adored and prominent figure. But there were signs that it was too good to be true. 3 separate lawsuits, all alleging sperm sample mix-ups, had been quietly settled out of court. The first dates back to 1995. Despite all that early legal trouble, the College of Physicians and Surgeons only ever sanctioned Barwin with a 2-month license suspension. Dr. Barwin has never publicly explained how this could have happened. The W5 has obtained this never-before-seen interview conducted in the midst of one of those lawsuits in 2009.
This is about risk not knowing. I mean, this is nothing what it wants to happen. And I'm very sick. I do this every day of my life. And over 30 years, this has happened without enough prison notice to do any other reason. It's just one of those things that's the only thing I want to happen is that happening.
Dr. Barwin goes so far as to imply that his patients should just be happy to have conceived.
I heard of the hurt that there has been is that they will be happy with the child that they have and enjoy that child.
In 2014, Norm Barwin resigned his medical license in the wake of the media attention from those early lawsuits. Since then, 50 people have come forward to join this class action. Each of them has just one question: why? Dr. Barwin refused W5's request for an interview, so we went to his home in Ottawa.
Mr. Barwin? Mr. Barwin? Hi, how are you? My name is Avery Haynes, and I'm a reporter with CTV 75. I was hoping that we could speak to you for just a couple of minutes. It's not fair for all of the people who are just hoping that we provide a DNA sample, or at least to give them some closure as to what the reason was for this.
After a few minutes, Barwin finally offered this.
Was it just something as simple as that you just wanted to help them have a child?
It was basically mediation. I'm sitting there and I have to say. I always want to just help people. That's all I can say.
Do you understand how painful this is for so many people, though?
I know I'm getting to this.
What he's going through is the last thing on the minds of those whose lives Barwin has turned upside down.
Great.
So he didn't give us anything else, but the difference between, really anything more, but he did speak to us a little bit. The difference between the way it would have been done, I think, in other times would be that the camera would have been right there in his face. We made a conscious decision to keep the camera far back. He hasn't been convicted of anything.
What did you think of it, Stuart?
I thought it added a whole new dimension to it. Like, kind of, I hadn't seen the whole piece, but I'm assuming you're going and sympathizing with these families, and then all of a sudden, here's a man. I just want to help people have babies, right? And that's fantastic when you can give people that experience, and it's what we should always be looking for. Sometimes we go into these stories and we dig and we get angry. It's like, that bastard did that stuff, Yeah. And then we kind of develop this kind of blinders, and when you actually hear that other side of the story, it can it changes. I was thinking of one example. because you'd asked me for some examples. Last year, I'd working on a story for a couple of years about a guy who had, according to the FBI, he'd smuggled, I think, almost 2,000 people from South Asia into the U.S. and mostly into Canada. And some of the people had been caught and they'd been abused. He was charging 50 grand or something each. And he'd been caught a couple of times, but he kept on doing it. And I kept looking for him, and these people had these refugees, had these horrific stories. And I spoke to some of them. And then I finally got hold of him. And he said, I don't make any money off this. All the money I get, I don't know if I believe him. He said, all the money I get goes to bribes, plane tickets, and safe houses.
He's a humanitarian.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm buying it, but when you get that, it gives the reader, viewer, whatever, that experience of feeling one way and then feeling it, and not being able to reconcile those two conflicting points of view. And I think that's what makes a fantastic story.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's great, because you had said before, Stuart, that you found TV needs a good guy and a bad guy. That's sort of what you found. There was more of a black and white kind of narrative going on in TV. So,
but I mean, there's not
I
always a
didn't
good
feel
guy.
that with this one, right? Like, I don't know if does anyone have any questions for Avery or Stuart? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you were clearly mic'd.
Yep.
Did he know that you were mic'd? Because I think that, I'll let you answer the question before I answer follow-up.
He didn't know I was mic'd when I came up, but he knew the camera was there. He saw it. We didn't air the part where he said, I can't believe, you've brought a television camera to my house.
Because I feel like he was a little more forthcoming with information, not shutting you down right away because he wasn't right.
Yeah, I also think just out of respect, I just think that there's an element of common decency as well. I mean, I went onto his driveway, and I think that that big camera is a really intimidating, aggressive thing on a big man's shoulder coming onto someone's property, and I think that's a bit unfair. And there are times where that isn't unfair. Like, I'm not saying that it's not, but I was mic'd. The camera was far back. He knew the camera was there, and I was surprised that he stayed as long. And I love the fact that you got that, because you're absolutely that you got the sense of confliction over, like, this guy he did terrible things. He doesn't just want to have people to have babies, and if he did, but it's all because it's about him. Right. He's using his own sperm when the father's sperm could have been used. It's not, he also cheated on 3 marathons, which as a marathon runner I find really offensive.
That's the real wrongdoing.
Like, I kind of feel like that should be the story. But he did cheat. He cheated on 3 marathons. He Rosie Perez did or whatever. He got on a cab and he went to the end and he came back through 3 times. And Greg McGregor in Ottawa did a story on it when he cheated in Ottawa and found out that he had cheated before. Wow. So anyway, I mean, the guy has got the serious issues of needing to be the best. But I did feel like standing on his driveway, I felt like, here's a man, he's married, he's got all of his own children. One's a Giller Award-winning author whose lives have been destroyed, all of these people. But that's also the beauty of long form.
Yeah.
That you can actually get that place.
That's great. Thank you. Marcia?
So when you decide to treat the interview that way, do you consider how the audience is going to receive that treatment?
I want to say no. Well, you know that what my answer is, because I honestly was so glad that I'm actually still losing my voice a bit, but I feel like that I don't have a lot of interest in reporting, chasing down the street, yelling at somebody for the sake of the camera catching me, being a reporter. I really don't find that to be particularly productive journalism. Sometimes it has to happen, I get that, but I feel like the viewer at home, at the point that in this story, the viewer wanted to hear from Norm Barwin, so it felt like it was okay to do it in a respectful way. I don't need to tell him that he's I don't need to start sort of adding in my perceptions of who he is or what he's done beyond but what the families have told me, how their lives have been affected.
That's great. Any other questions about this one?
If it hadn't been a big guy with a big camera, it just being like, like this, would it have been, like camera and a lipstick or pen or whatever? Would it make any difference?
So that's a really good question. Just on like those lipstick and pen cameras I would never do that for an accountability interview because that's a bit. I don't think I would.
No, I'm not suggesting you seek.
Oh.
I'm just suggesting.
If there were
The camera and I'm just
Right.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
kind of feel maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I've thought about it too much because I struggled with going up to this older man's house on this, but in some ways the distance of the camera I think made it more compelling instead of it being, because for me it was uncomfortable to look into his eyes and know that he didn't want me there, which I think the viewer would also have felt if it was right in his face. So maybe in some ways giving that distance made it even more compelling. You would have seen his chin quivering when he was talking to me and his eyes darting around. So you missed that, but I think you may have gained something in the shaky sort of back camera.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Is that what you meant?
I think cameras
to
are.
get the
I think
close-up.
cameras are intimidating. Was it the 5,000-pound pencil they call it or something? I mean,
Yeah.
having worked in print and in TV, I find people are completely different on camera. The kind of interviews that you do on camera, people just automatically, it becomes this formal thing. People are nervous and they speak more formally. They're just not as relaxed as in print, where you can, you have the luxury of just sort of being able to shoot the shit, and also the luxury of sometimes them saying, can you not? I'll talk to you, but can you not say that? You can. There's some sort of negotiation that you can do. Obviously, you want to get as much as you can from him.
It's interesting.
But it's a different. It just creates a whole different climate. Don't you find it?
I have to say, sorry, but so I've gone from either shooting myself, not like shooting myself, but like shooting myself, or with one cameraman at City. W5, I mean, I'm intimidated when I go for a scheduled interview. You know what this is like. It is insane. I don't know, it's like you're locking somebody into a roller coaster when they sit in that chair, because there are 3 different cameras that are essentially acting like a pod around the person. And to me, what I think that my best skill now has to be is making the person who's sitting there feel comfortable enough, and to try to eliminate that, because it is, that big 3-camera shoot is super intimidating.
Right, and I'd like to say it's this, having been a field producer for 20 years, it's also part of the job of the field producers to get them
Comfortable.
Hey, we're going to just rearrange your house and add 25 cameras, now act natural.
Yeah.
The best thing you can have is a cameraman or a camera person who is able to put people at ease, like a sense of humor or something.
Yeah,
for
that's
sure.
the best call. So there were 2 more questions. Actually, go ahead and then
The other one is having worked with somebody who suffered from this. What about when you're doing an accountability interview and they really have no idea that they've done anything wrong? Did I say I was Mike Duffy's producer? Or they really don't know that they really have no perception that what they did was wrong.
Do you have an example?
Mike Duffy. They don't see what they did as being wrong. There's like a psychological blind spot for it. So you sitting them down and you just going, you did this and this and this and
Right.
this.
Yeah.
And they don't perceive it as being wrong.
But the viewer gets that. The viewer sees it. And the viewer really does see it. And they can see you working 10 ways to Sunday to try to ask the same question in a different way. So I think that the viewer sees it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that's so frustrating. And I brought a clip of politicians. It really is not an example of a great accountability interview with a politician, but I included it only because it's so frustrating. I mean, I just find the reporters who work on Parliament Hill or at Queen's Park or at City Hall deserve so much to be able to withstand nonstop baffle gab. I can't stand it.
Yeah.
But you're setting it up that this person knows that they've intentionally done this wrong.
Right.
And how do you almost say that
But then if you see it, then the viewer sees it as well. Like if that's what comes to, yeah, so do I.
Is that part of your preparation? Like, I assume you might know that going in, you must have known a little bit about what this guy's feeling was about this, right?
Yeah.
Like, is that how you guys prepare for?
Yeah, well,
Like
I mean, we kind of had this experience a few months ago, and we did this series on basically how there was people that the government had been trying to deport for a long time, but were still here. And we found this one guy that agreed to an interview who had been here for a long time, and almost immediately after arriving here, he committed an aggravated assault, and then he raped a woman, and on and on and on. And he had this huge, long criminal record. And he agreed to talk to us. And in the interview, we had that exact experience where I said, well, can you understand why Canadians might be, a little concerned about this kind of thing, because you've got dozens of criminal convictions, and you haven't been deported. And he said, no, I don't. And I said, well, yeah, you do. No, I don't have that many. And I said, well, here they are. And I had the piece
See,
of paper.
that's a moment.
ready.
Was this on television or was this for?
I don't know if we use it.
Because that's kind of like the dream moment. That's
But,
awesome.
I mean, basically, the lesson is to know your facts.
Yeah.
Like you go into the interview knowing so that you can't be led astray, and something like that could slip by.
That's great. Did you had a question? I'm sorry, in the blue jacket? Yeah.
I was wondering anyway, how you feel about how far you go with your question line before you might suspect that you're leading someone in a certain direction, especially when they're kind of being standoffish or not, not fully shooting you down, but they're kind of engaging, and you're like, well, how far down this road do I go to kind of take you in the direction that I want to go before you feel like you're leading them to a certain answer?
You mean like, well, in this Barwin as an example, or just in general?
I kind of was thinking of it there. I mean, it was...
I was giving him an answer?
I didn't feel like you were giving it, but it was kind of like, did you feel this? And like, I mean, that seemed like a safe, nice question, right? Like, yes, I felt bad, sure. Yeah, well, lead a question. Like, so how
well,
far
the thing is, like, this, so the ideal jump on scheduled interview lasts about a minute, and the person said, because you're not, am I telling tales out of school?
Yeah, no,
by
I think
telling
that's
this?
fair, yeah.
Right,
80% of the time, they're like, get away from here, I don't want to talk to you. I said, no, read the statement.
And then you leave, like that. So when it goes on for a long time, it becomes a little bit more complicated, because to be fair to that person, you can't just put them saying no if they sat there for sort of 10 minutes talking to you and then said no. Dr. Barwin talked to me for a really long time. Like, I couldn't get him to he wasn't going to talk, but he needed to go in. He needed to walk away, but he sort of kept chatting with me. So that was edited down from about 5 or 6 minutes, which generally, I was expecting him to just say no and walk in. I think that the question led him somewhere, but it was already somewhere that he had spoken about in the clip before, about wanting to help people. So yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying. There's a point where on those unscheduled interviews, generally, you sort of know that the person is not going to give you much.
Yeah. How did you prepare? Did you have a list of questions?
No, I never do lists of questions.
Oh,
it's funny. I feel as though I just try to know everything that I want to know, and then let it be a conversation. And even when it's an interview with a politician, I won't write down questions, because I know what my first question is, and I know what I'm hoping to get out of it. But I feel as though having questions throws me off in not thinking about listening. And I know this is like the corniest thing, but being a journalist is listening. I think the biggest thing is listening. And the number of stories that have taken me in different directions, even in accountability interviews, because I listened to the answer to the question before, is huge. And if you have the questions then you're like, oh my God, I didn't ask number 4, right?
It's true.
I do list questions for important interviews.
But you also did for us.
You see, I know. I'm hyper prepared.
I love it.
But I think for me, I think everyone's different. I do like to have the questions drafted, and not just drafted. Like, think about the sequence, and where you're trying to take things. But you also have to be willing to throw it out if if things change and if the answers take you somewhere else.
That's interesting.
See,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
always say, another reason why I don't write down questions is that when I'm trying to make someone feel comfortable in doing an interview with me, and this is straying a little bit from accountability, but I always feel so honored that somebody who has gone through something will sit and talk to me in front of a camera and share their story. I mean, I still to this day, I've been doing this for a really long time. I feel a huge amount of honor and the need to respect them. And what I always tell them is, this is not an interview. Please do not think of this as an interview. It's you know all of the answers to the questions I'm going to ask you because it's about you, and it's just us having a conversation. And then if I come up and it's like, wait a second, it takes it away from it being the conversation.
No, that's interesting, and maybe it's me not phrasing the question properly, because it's interesting when we prepare journalists to go out and do these interviews. It's like, what are the top 3 questions you want to get out there? What's the first most important question if the person slams the door and doesn't want to talk to you? So it's like really thinking that through is advice we give, but it can also intimidate someone, like now hearing you talk, because if you're really trying to nail down that question, I guess in your own words, like, what's the question we want? What's the second one? And then oftentimes people sometimes stay and talk to you like he did, right? So, you know,
I find, for me, I'm usually trying to get a person's story, and people, I find, don't speak chronologically. They jump from here to there, and it's really difficult to follow. And so that's part of what I do when I'm structuring an interview is just trying to keep people, and sometimes the next question is just, what happened next? What happened next? But I find, so that you can really understand a person and their story, to be organized in that way so that you can help guide them down. And, I mean, we're helping them tell their story. Part of what we do is helping people tell their side of the story.
Right.
And
that's great.
So,
thank you. Should we watch another one?
I think the second, I hope it is the next one, is not, again, I mean, it's the health minister. We had done an investigation into drug diversion in hospitals, so how the opioid crisis was affecting nurses in Canadian hospitals. So what we found is that the government was, and the health minister and the health ministries were doing nothing to help nurses and to not be punitive when they caught them stealing patients' drugs. And we had really laid out an awful lot of sort of mishmash of rules that ended up putting patients at risk because drug-addicted nurses were stealing their medication, and also not getting nurses the help that they needed. So we had requested an interview with the health minister for months, and she refused to sit down, which is really an affront to the Canadian public. I really do believe that as the health minister in the midst of an opioid crisis, when she has said that this is high on her priority. She's happy to travel sort of around where there are junkies, but not really taking it much further. So we had to meet, we had sort of 2 minutes with her outside of question period on Parliament Hill. I think this is going to be a little bit of the last one, but. Yeah, so it's just coming up, yeah.
Health Canada does not keep track of healthcare workers who steal drugs. Instead, it logs how many times narcotics themselves are stolen, tracking individual pills and vials. Hospitals are supposed to report that information to Health Canada, but there is no guarantee they will. A W5 Access to Information request reveals only 487 reported incidents of loss or theft of hospital drugs in 2016. With more than 1,500 hospitals in Canada, that would mean if each of these reports came from a different hospital, fewer than a third reported even a single pill or vial going missing in an entire year. A case like Julie's, which her hospital did not report to anyone, wouldn't be reflected in these statistics. For months, we've been trying to set up an interview with Health Minister Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor to talk about this problem and what her ministry plans to do about it. In the end, she would only give us a few minutes after question period.
Diversion experts, addiction experts are saying that this is a silent epidemic, the stealing of drugs by nurses, and I'm asking you as a health minister whether you need to put this on your radar.
It's absolutely
So she didn't answer. Yeah.
We can.
National Addictions Program.
So she didn't answer the question, and the best that could come out of that is just that you hope that the viewer is like, okay, that she just is saying absolutely nothing at all.
What did you guys think?
Frustrating, right? Like, yeah.
That's what you were talking about, right? The constant spin, and how do you break through it like that?
No, I mean, she knew exactly what she was doing. I just think there are a lot of people out there who are doing bad things who don't really understand
Oh, right.
that they are doing something bad. And as you say, it becomes obvious. But there are a number of people who do not recognize that what they've done is wrong.
Right. Great, thank you. And we talked about, so with politicians, how far should we go? Because I think, would you both agree that if they say no, that we should do whatever it takes? Is that a fair thing? To just kind of jump them or reach them, unscheduled interview in that way? Like
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this before, that I think there's probably certain categories of people where readers and viewers expect us to chase after them and try to get an answer for them. And politicians would be at the top. People with power, people in positions of power, I think we're kind of obliged to go after them.
Yeah. I think there's a different set of rules when it comes to politicians, but I also think that dance that happens is I think that viewers and readers are really savvy and very cynical right now. Yeah. And so, you hope that when a politician refuses to answer a question, that the viewer maintains that cynicism of like, okay, that's the health minister, and she can't even speak in anything other than sort of baffle-gab when it comes to a major point of her portfolio. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a different sort of realm when it comes to politicians.
And what do you guys think? Does anyone have any comment about that? Like, did that feel fair to everyone in the room?
I feel like my stuff is being sort of
yeah.
No, you're not allowed to ask.
I think if it had been a local news interview with, this is stuff
yeah.
people are watching, you're assuming a certain amount of media literacy. I think if it had been a local interview, I would have wanted to say something like, when the minister refused to answer a question directly.
And watching that back, we should have done that. I 100% agree. That the tagline coming out of it, we say, she may not have been able to, she may have refused to answer our questions, but may not have been strong enough.
Right.
Because, people aren't sitting there watching like this. They're doing all kinds of other things at the same time. So I think you're right that hammering it home in cases where politicians may not be up front is probably, that could have been done better. I agree.
There's also there's this tendency sometimes I've seen where people have very, very specific questions that they shout at a politician or something. And I mean, the politician doesn't know the answer. I mean, they live at this level up here. They don't necessarily know about some individual specific case, right? So there's some unfairness about that kind of theatrical setup where we're expecting a minister to be able to answer to a very detailed kind of anecdote or something.
So on this story, just in self-defense, she was given months and months and months of the research that we had compiled, and we requested her to come up with some kind of a discussion with us about what her ministry was doing about it.
Right, and I like that you actually said that, and we talked about that for those who were in the last keynote about being transparent about how long it's taking you to reach someone. So that was great that you said it was months.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, and that was good for the viewer to see that. And there's a privilege working on these long format shows where you can do that, but how do you do accountability with shorter timelines, right? When government officials won't talk to you, they're just going to issue a statement. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. Having both worked.
I did. When I was at City, I did a fair number of investigations, but those were investigations that would have to be done at the end of my day after doing my daily reporting. But I did an investigation into what happens when police officers are convicted of a crime. What does the Police Services Board do once they've been convicted? And so I looked at all of the police forces in the GTA, and that was complete data. And that was sympathetic cops helping me, but that was not, I knew I was never going to get an accountability interview on that ever. It wasn't going to happen. And it really was a tagline because, like you said, I mean, you're going to go to individual police chief and say, why does this, you know, it really, the accountability comes in the facts that you've presented.
Right. And I guess following the story, right?
Yeah.
Keep chasing
Well, that's the
it.
beauty of online too, is that
Yeah.
you can, as the comments come, you can insert them into the story and press update.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. And go ahead, Marcia.
You said deciding, Stuart, deciding on who's accountable for making a judgment call, bias. Has there been a moment where you realized that perhaps you didn't have the right person, or maybe you wanted to rethink that person, and what happened?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm not going to be able to give an example right now because I can't think of one off the top of my head. But to me, that's how it should be. I mean, and that's, you know, it's just when you go into a story, you need to keep open-minded. Pre-planning a story never works. You just have to, and that's the great thing, it's being able to follow a story in unexpected directions. And somebody you thought accountable, oh, well, it's not. It's something else. And that's the best fun of reporting. And it's also, I think, readers find it the most rewarding and the most kind of rich stories.
On this convict cops investigation that I did, it was a perfect example of exactly this. I went, like, these are bad cops doing bad things, and yet they're still allowed to be cops. And I had a video of a cop wailing on a young person in the back of his cruiser. It was dash cam video. And so he was part of my story. And I aired that video. And on my Facebook, I got a message from somebody saying, you don't know anything about that cop. And it was the cop's sister. And I ended up doing an interview with the cop who gave me such a different perspective of the PTSD that he had suffered that had been untreated because Toronto police are terrible at helping, have had difficulties in helping officers deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. And he had been begging for help, and he lost it in this moment. So I told his story. And then I got a Facebook message from a woman who said, you don't know anything about the kid that was back in the back of that car, and that kid was at your house for Christmas dinner. The kid was a friend of my son's, and I had a bunch of his friends over for Christmas dinner. And that teenager had gone through almost a parallel life history of what the cop had gone through, with addiction issues, with untreated mental illness issues, and they had converged on this moment. And the story just took this crazy turn that was it was just one of the strangest coincidences of things I've ever had happen in my life.
Wow.
Also, I mean, if it's a good story, almost every person that you interview has a different idea of who is to blame or who is to be held account. And I'm just thinking of this one story I worked on a few years ago. I don't know if you've heard of this guy, but maybe 4 years ago, I got a call from this mother in Calgary, and her son had gone to Syria to fight. His name was Damien Claremont, to fight with the rebels there. And so, you know, I talked to everybody, including him. His mom gave me his phone number, and I ended up conversing with him for a while until he got killed. But the mom blamed CSIS and the government for not preventing her son from leaving because they were aware. The government and the cops were sort of, you know, blaming the person who they think radicalized this kid. The kid was blaming Canadian society for being this horrible place that didn't, you know, sort of coincide with his own ideological viewpoint. I think everybody had a different idea of who was responsible. So that, you know, it can get complicated.
Yeah, that's interesting. Multiple accountability, right? Yeah. Do you guys have any secrets to share about some of your toughest interviews and how you prepared for them? Any advice you want to give to some of the younger reporters out here?
Well, I mean, just to be ready and to be prepared. I mean, as you possibly can. You don't know everything, but also to be, as I was saying, to be open to the journey of the story. That you don't really. You might think you know it, but you have to be open to the possibility that you don't really understand it all.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I think that comes with confidence and sort of time in the field. But I think that you go in thinking a story is one thing, but being completely open to whatever may happen, and that is, I think, the most beautiful sweet spot of journalism, where you think it's something and then it turns out to be something else. And I think the question why is the most underused question in reporting. Is why. I think that is my secret weapon, because anytime someone has said something and you just stop and say why, you end up getting such a fantastic secondary answer.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? No. What time is it? Oh, it's 2:11. Okay, we've kind of used up the time. This is good. Do we have any final thoughts on accountability interviews in this day and age when most of what we're being told by the people who are accountable is no? Like, is there any other sort of final stuff you want to share?
I think we should just throw away the term altogether. Just interview.
Yeah.
It's just basic reporting. And I'm not sure there is a special category for that type of interview. I think it's just one of the basic steps that we go through.
I brought a piece of the Jehovah's Witness if we had time for it. If we don't, I'll just talk about it a little bit. And just that I think that, when you're focusing on a story that you know needs an accountability interview, there are times where there's a discussion about, well, if you can't get someone to be held accountable, how do you properly fully tell the story? And more, I think there's a recognition that you either get creative with, and obviously being fair with statements and stuff like that. But in this, we did a 1-hour doc on Jehovah's Witnesses and their global cover-up of sexual assault allegations, all based on doctrine within their very preachings, which states that unless there are 2 witnesses to any abuse, it doesn't happen. So as an organization, which is one of the richest charities in Canada, which is surprising to most people, because you kind of think of them as the benign folks who just sort of knock on the door and are they're not Scientologists. They never ever give interviews, and we knew going in that we were going to be sort of laying out all of this stuff that they would never respond to except for a statement. But they did give us a statement, but it's the same statement they use every time anyone asks them anything about this this 2-witness rule. So it kind of ended up, they didn't speak, but by not speaking, it was okay too. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, both of you, for taking the time to do this today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.